Hello everyone, welcome to my video presentation. As you can see on the screen, our topic is web, how to use web listener. Web listener, web container events including session creation attribute in activation and activation are monitored using servlet listeners. Events are generated by the servlet container and cause the behavior of event listener classes. The scope of these events will be either at the request session or application level. All of the listeners associations with a given application are configured by the web container at the time of development. Using the features of listener included the servlet, we can make the web application which responds to events taking place in a web application. These events can be of request, session or application level scope. To use servlet listener, first listener class must be made ready by implementing the corresponding listener interface. Second, the prepared listener class must be mapped using web XML mapping or example listener class comJIAT web app listener class clause listener annotation based mapping example annotation web listener public class request listener implements servlet request listener public void request destroyed servlet request event public void request initialize servlet request event. Request listener. First, Java X servlet request listener. The interface listens to request servlet request event. When request is created or destroyed, it gives a notification. Servlet request listener defines two methods. First, void request initialize. Servlet request event. This method is executed when request is initialized. Example, override public void request initialized servlet request event SRE system.out.println request initialized servlet request equals SRE.get servlet request HTTP servlet request char is equal HTTP servlet request srs.get servlet response. Second, void request destroy. Servlet request event. This method is executed when request is destroyed. Example, override public void request destroyed. Servlet request event star e system.out.println request destroyed. Java X servlet request attribute listener. This interface listens to servlet request attribute event. When any object is added, Remote or replace from request is given out in notification. Servlet request attribute listener define three methods. Attribute added. Servlet request attribute event E. It notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the request. Example, public void attribute added, servlet request attribute event, servlet request attribute event. System.out.println attribute has been added. String attribute name equals servlet request attribute event.getName. Object attribute value equals servlet request attribute event.getValue. Object output system.out.println attribute name plus attribute name. System.out.println attribute value plus attribute value to string. Context listener. Java X servlet context listener. The interface listens to the servlet context event. When servlet context is initialized or destroyed, servlet context listener given notification. Servlet context listener defines two methods. First, context initialize. Servlet context event E method execute when an application is developed. Example, override public void context initialize. Servlet context event SRE. System.out.println context initialize. Servlet context equal SRE dot get servlet context. Void context destroy. Servlet context event E method execute when application is being destroyed. Example, override public void context destroy. Servlet context event SRE. System.out.println context destroy. Java X servlet context attribute listener. This interface listener to the session context attributes event. When an object is added, removed or replaced from servlet context is given a notification. Servlet context attribute listener defines two ways. Attribute added servlet context attribute event E method notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the servlet context. Example, override public void attribute added. Servlet context attribute event. System.out.println attribute added plus event.getName plus equal plus event.getValue. Session listener. Java X servlet http session listener. This interface listener to HTTP session event when session is created by destroyed it values a notification. HTTP session listeners define two methods. Void session created HTTP session event E. This method is executed when session is created. Example, public void session create HTTP session event SE. System.out.println session created plus se.get session dot get id. Void session destroyed HTTP session event E. This method is executed when session is destroyed. destroyed. Example: public void session destroy HTTP session event SE. System.out.println session destroy plus se.get session dot get id. JavaX servlet HTTP session attribute listener. This interface listeners to HTTP session begin event. When any object is added, remote of replaced and session as given a notification. HTTP session attribute listener define three methods. Attribute added HTTP session begin finding event in. This method notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the session. Example: public void attribute added HTTP servlet binding event. System.out.println event.getName plus event.getValue. Attribute remote HTTP session binding event E. This method notified whenever the attribute is remote the session. Example: public void attribute remote HTTP session being event out. System.out.println event.getName plus event.getValue. Attribute replaced HTTP session binding event E. This method notifies whenever the attributes get replaced on the session. Public void attribute replaced HTTP session binding event. System.out.println event.getName plus event.getValue. HTTP session binding listener. By implementing this interface, object teams can learn whether they have been added to or withdrawn from a session. HTTP session binding listener listens to HTTP session binding event and define following method. First one, value bound HTTP session bind event. This method notifies object when object is added to session. Second, value unbound HTTP session bind event E. This method notifies when object is removed from session. HTTP session activation listener. When a session object is moved from one virtual machine to another, the HTTP session actual listener interface is invoked to listener for change in the state of the session. HTTP session actual listener only has any relevance when a session is part of a web application in a distributed environment. Therefore, it is not possible to provide an example. HTTP session activation listener interface defines two methods. First, session did execute HTTP session event. This method is executed when session has active. Session will passivate. HTTP session event is this method will execute when session is about to passivate.